Doing dualies, they're awesome. Before I was the pompous man I am now. I was a pretentious child. That's how it works. Pretense matures into pomposity. In second grade, this really began to manifest as I began carrying a copy of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground around with me. I concealed in it comic books that I actually enjoy reading. But I wanted people to think that in my spare time I read introspective Russian melancholic literature. I knew that Dostoevsky wrote introspective Russian melancholic literature because at our house in Schuylerville, New York, my parents threw occasional cocktail parties for faculty from Skidmore College, where my father taught in nearby Saratoga Springs, and I listened to everything that was said. I didn't actually know what introspective or melancholic meant, but I knew I wanted to be perceived as someone who not only knew what they meant, but thoroughly enjoyed them in all their complexity and nuance. Other words whose meanings I did not yet know. It was not until many years later that I actually read Dostoevsky and found that I really did love introspective Russian melancholic literature, and that the novella was startlingly funny. Second grade. Someone who's read it and was remembering. Second grade was also the year that I started getting called into the principal's office on a regular basis for disagreeing with my teachers. I would challenge the nature or the substance of a lesson presented in class. The teacher would offer a quick rebuttal. I would refuse to let the point go, and eventually I would be sent to the principal's office. Then my father would be called into school, and rather than simply scolding me to respect my elders, he would learn the details of the debate and take sides. He usually took my side. While my pretense had not yet matured into proper pomposity, I was already frequently right. I remember a couple of specific instances. During a social studies lesson, our teacher explained to us that in America we have an educational system that teaches the truth of history and science. Whereas in the Soviet Union, teachers brainwashed children into believing that communism was good and democracy evil. I raised my hand, and when called upon, suggested that my teacher was doing precisely that same kind of indoctrination. She insisted that communism was repressive and evil, whereas under democracy we had valued freedoms of religion and speech and so on. Mouthing words I only half understood but was certain I had retained correctly, I pointed out that the two cannot be compared, as democracy is a governmental system and communism is an economic model. Then I was sent to the principal's office. My father was called at work. He drove from Skidmore College to Schuylerville Central School. The principal told him that I had been arguing with my teacher in class. I recounted the details of the disagreement. My father's eyebrows rose and he said, "You've really been listening at those parties, haven't you?" He told the principal that I had the right of it, and I was sent back to class. My father made no mention of the copy of Kierkegaard's On the Concept of Irony with Continual Reference to Socrates that I carried with me as I returned to class. Although, many years later, he did write a play in which he made passing reference to a kid who carried around a copy of Remembrance of Things Past with Action Comics tucked between the pages, so I think he knew what was going on. My father and I were very close. We have similar looks, similar intellects. He claims that he had no mannerisms until I was born, and then he began to adopt mine. I wanted very much to be like him when I was a child. I wanted to be fearlessly intellectual and always right. Another time that same year, the physical education instructor came into our classroom to teach a health class, which was really just an hour or so of anti-drug messaging as it was delivered in those pre-Reagan years before object lessons were replaced with sloganeering. The man stood at the front of the room and told us generally that drugs are bad, and then provided anecdotal evidence to support his blanket claims of badness. Having been to parties at which Skidmore College faculty members smoked pot and snorted cocaine and drank, I knew firsthand that not all drug use resulted in death or addiction. From what I could tell, drug use mainly resulted in laughter and hyper-intellectual conversation that went on way past my bedtime and then murmured on into the night from the distant living room to filter under my bedroom door as a mutter-and-chat film score to accompany my dreams. This gym teacher, though, said that a couple of years back, Tommy Hurston had taken LSD. He might have said, taken the LSD. And had been driving on Route 29 when he hallucinated a dragon rising up out of the road, swerved to avoid it, and slammed into a tree. Tommy, we were told, was killed instantly, and when they pulled his body from the crushed car, the speedometer was... You okay? I worried, because I heard phlegm splattering against your scarf. Tommy, we were told, was killed instantly when they pulled his body from the crushed car. The speedometer was stuck at 105. I raised my hand until I was acknowledged, and feeling very much as though I had solved an Encyclopedia Brown mystery without looking up the how did he know explanation. I said, if Tommy Hurston was killed instantly, how do you know what he hallucinated before swerving off Route 29? And I was sent to the principal's office. And my father was called in to come take sides in the debate. Eventually, my father asked me to stop arguing with my teachers and bring my questions and concerns home to him. He told me that I was allowed to think for myself, to disagree with what I was being taught, but it was not my job to publicly confront my teachers, to challenge their authority in front of the class, to single-handedly correct every flaw I noticed in an imperfect public education system. I did my best to comply with his request, though at times it rankled. Frog and dog do not rhyme just because they both end with OG and Ms. Toomey has a weird upstate New York accent that flattens everything out. My wife and I had a big argument about this because she said that frog and dog do rhyme. And I said that I was not sanguine with that. And that's when we argued about the pronunciation of the word sanguine. Turns out it's sanguine, which is what she said. By the time I was in 6th grade, my reading skills were better than those of most of the high school kids in Schuylerville. I had already performed in 2 plays put on at Skidmore College, one directed by the man who headed the theater department there before my father took over, and one directed by a student. In both cases, they needed a male child actor, and it come directly to me. I don't remember having to audition for either part. So, in 6th grade, it was unsurprising to me, in fact it seemed quite natural, when my teacher told me that all the grade school teachers had discussed it, and that they would like me to choose and direct the school play for that year. I took the task very seriously. I began reading plays in a way I never had before. Inspiration struck when I read Peter Schaeffer's Royal Hunt of the Sun. The play centered on the relationship between Atahualpa Inca and Pizarro, the conquistador, who demanded that the Inca bring him piles and piles of gold before committing genocide against them. As one of very few Jews in town, and having been threatened for my lunch money frequently by the fascist forces of playground bulliedom, this play spoke to me. The injustice, the powerlessness of the kind and generous Inca in the face of overwhelming and inexplicable Christian violence and greed touched a nerve in me, and I had visions of the staging. Even as I read the text, I made a 3-ring director's binder for myself with the pages of the script alternating with blank pages on which I could make notes. I wrote up a budget. I handed it in for approval. Had I merely said that I needed $58 for 3 full bolts of bright red silk, everything might have gone through smoothly. But I was pretentious and growing into pomposity. I was quite taken with my plans. So what I said in the proposal budget was that I needed $58 for 3 bolts of bright red silk to flow from the mouth of the sun god, representing the rivers of blood shed by the evil forces of Christianity as embodied by the conquistadors. The following morning, I was unexpectedly called out of class, taken into the empty cafeteria, and interviewed for nearly an hour by a psychologist. I was sent back to class. Later in the day, I was called into the principal's office, where I sat in near silence with the principal and the psychologist as we waited for the arrival of my father, who had already been called. I remember seeing the family car pull up into the parking lot. I remember my father seen through the principal's window coming across the asphalt with his feet lost in that heat wave reflection as the sun came up off the pavement as far as his ankles. I feared he would be angry. It had been a few years now since he had been called in, and I still didn't know what I had done wrong. I couldn't recall having argued with any of my teachers. I had quietly spoken with my homeroom teacher about a math problem she'd graded wrong. But she had quickly conceded that the error was in fact in her teacher's book and not in my work. And then she had corrected my grade and later told everyone in class to add a point to their own grades if they'd gotten that one right and it had been graded wrongly. She hadn't given me public credit for noticing the erroneous deduction. I didn't claim it. It didn't seem to me that this was anything that could have gotten me into trouble. My father came in. He sat down in the hard plastic chair to my right. He said, "So what's going on?" The principal introduced the psychologist to my father. The principal began a bit hesitantly. He said, "Mr. Brody, as you may or may not be aware, your son was asked to choose and to direct the school play this year. The teachers felt, all of them, that this would be a good outlet for his creativity and his." He seemed to be at a loss, and the psychologist picked up the conversation, saying, "The budget your son presented for the play included a troubling item." "Oh," my father said. The psychologist gave the principal an encouraging nod, and the principal said, "He asked for $58 to purchase," he read directly from the budget page I had handed in, "3 bolts of bright red silk to flow from the mouth of a sun god representing rivers of blood shed by the evil forces of Christianity as embodied by the conquistadors." My father gasped. His head snapped around to face me. With a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, he said, "Are you doing Royal Hunt of the Sun?" My budget was not approved. The principal read the play, and the school play assignment was taken away from me and handed over to the music instructor. He directed a prudishly abbreviated version of Oklahoma, which was performed out of key as though it was a conceptual choice, which is what I said in the review I submitted to the school district. The review was rejected in favor of a rave written by a faculty member. I sent a letter to the editor in which I discussed the nature of censorship, Soviet-style control of the press, and the creeping nature of fascism. That letter was also not published. Sitting in the principal's office with me and the teacher who supervised the paper and the one who wrote the review they had run, my father said that I had formed cogent arguments, but that I must learn, if I intended to write persuasive prose, to control my emotional bias and refrain from ad hominem attacks on those with whom I disagree. I asked him if an ad hominem attack was an attack that sounded just like another attack, but had a different meaning. My father laughed. I smiled. And nobody else in the room had any idea what we were talking about. Thank you.